You know, there's an old saying around here. The saying goes something like, North Carolina is a valley of humility between two mountains of conceit. But I've always thought of it more of a land of long shadows. We've got history baked into the red clay and the salt air. But some of that history, it doesn't stay in the books. It wanders. Tonight, we aren't looking at cold cases or police files. We're sitting out here in the evening air to talk about the stories. Well, they belong to the land themselves. We're talking about lights that shouldn't be there, ships that sailed themselves home, and things that lived here long before we ever drew a map. Pull up a chair. Let's start with a young man named Edwin, a horse, and a promise that not even death could break. Let's go back to 1910. Greenville, North Carolina was a different world then. It had a small teacher training school. You know the place. We like to call it East Carolina University today. The doors, well, they had just opened a year earlier. And then that's where Edwin Cox, a local Greenville boy, that's where he met her. Now her name's lost to history now, but we do know Edwin. Edwin was smitten. Now, she had gone up to Richmond, Virginia for a visit, and she was supposed to take the train back down. Now, Edwin, being the serious romantic that he was, decided he wasn't going to wait at the station in town. No, he wanted to be the first face she saw. So, he saddled up his horse and rode out past the little community of Pactolus just to meet her at the junction. The problem was, trains in 1910 didn't exactly run on a Swiss watch. Dusk started to fall, and that Richmond, Virginia train was nowhere to be seen. Edwin was sitting out there in unfamiliar countryside as the light turned purple and the shadows stretched out from the pines. He was worried, not for himself, but that his girl would think he hadn't shown up. But Edwin wasn't the only one out that night. A few local ne'er-do-wells were walking those tracks that night, and they were looking for trouble. They did see Edwin, but more importantly, they saw his horse, and they wanted a ride, and they weren't the type to ask. They ambushed him as he rode past, and they killed young Edwin Cox right there in the dark and stuffed his body deep into thick undergrowth, right where the water meets the rail line. Now, they tried to take that horse, but the horse spooked and bolted. A few days later, the horse showed back up in Greenville, exhausted, without a rider, and terrified. And that's when Edwin's family, they knew. They searched every inch of those woods, but they never found Edwin. Now, some people say Edwin found a way to finish his errand. To this day, out where those old tracks used to run, folks every now and then see a light. Now, it's not a train, and it's certainly not a flashlight. It's a bobbing, searching glow. They say it's Edwin, still out there in the dark, waving his lantern to let his true love know that he did come for her. He was there. Edwin, he never broke his promise. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, come on, Timmy, that's a real nice story from 1910. But that's all it is, a story. And I'll be real honest, a lot of the time, I'd be inclined to agree with you. But as I was digging around through some reports online, preparing this episode, I found an account that stopped me cold. This wasn't some campfire tale. This was a modern encounter from a person who claims they were there. Seems back around 2004, a group of about 8 people were out on the same rural farm path in Pactolus. It's a spot everyone in the area knows is famous for the light. Now, they weren't looking for trouble. They were just out there to see if the stories were true. And they got their answer. Now, according to one of them, who by those accounts would be in their 40s today, they were standing in that field, and out of nowhere, a bright, glowing spear just appeared right in midair. It wasn't drifting, and it wasn't a firework. It was hovering about 6 or 7 feet off the ground, just about head high. And it was maybe 60 to 100 feet away from where they were standing. They described the thing as being about a foot wide. Now, think about it like this, roughly about the size of a basketball. Just a solid ball of silent white light. Now, this ball of light, it didn't move. It just sat there, suspended in the air for maybe just a second or two. Just long enough for a group of people to collectively hold their breath and realize they were seeing something impossible. And then, just as suddenly as it arrived, it vanished. No sound, no smoke, no trace. The witness, well, they say they've spent years looking at other accounts online, and half of them look fake to him. But he claims he knows what he saw. And he says it's the only thing in his entire life that he simply cannot explain. It's a lonely thing, a light looking for a home, but some mysteries are even lonelier because they leave behind everything except the people. Let's head east to the graveyard of the Atlantic for our next story. Now, you can't talk about North Carolina without talking about the graveyard of the Atlantic. Down there around Cape Hatteras, the warm Gulf Stream hits the cold Labrador Current, and it creates these shifting sandbars that the locals call diamond shoals. Now, these diamond shoals, they've swallowed thousands of ships. There's one ship, it seems the ocean decided to spit it back out. Well, at least the wood part of it. Back in early 1921, a massive 5-masted schooner called the Carol A. Deering was making its way back home from Brazil. Now, this wasn't some tiny fishing boat. She was a thing of beauty, a coal hauler, built for the big water. But things didn't go well on that trip. The man in charge was Captain Willis Wormel. He was an old pro, a straight shooter type, but he'd been called in last minute because the original captain got sick. Now, Wormel didn't trust his crew, and he probably had a right not to. He actually wrote a letter during a stop-off saying the crew was factitious, which is just an old-fashioned way of saying they were a hair's breadth away from a mutiny. The last time anyone saw a living soul on the ship was January the 28th. A lightship keeper off Cape Lookout saw the Deering pass by. He claimed a man with a red beard and a foreign accent shouted through a megaphone that the ship had lost its anchors, but he didn't sound like a man in distress. However, 3 days later, the Deering was found hard aground on those diamond shoals. And when the rescue crews finally managed to board her through the heavy surf, they walked into a nightmare made out of ordinary things. Now imagine this. You walk into the galley, and the table is set for the crew's dinner. There's food still sitting in the pots on the stove, and it's still warm. There's coffee sitting in the pot, just starting to grow cold. It looked like 20 men had just stood up from their plates and walked into the sea. Everything was there: the food, the personal trunks, the spare clothes. But the lifeboats were gone. The logbook was missing, and not a single person, not even the ship's cat, were anywhere to be found. There was no blood, no signs of a fight or any kind of struggle. Just silence. Well, for weeks the coast was buzzing. People thought maybe pirates had gotten them, or maybe those rum runners that used to haunt the coast during Prohibition. But then on April the 11th, a local fisherman named Elias Gray. You just gotta love those old Carolina names. Well, Elias was walking the beach near Buxton, and he spotted a bottle bobbing in the surf. Now, Elias retrieved the bottle, and inside was a note. It was written in a frantic hand, and it said, "Deering captured by oil-burning boat." Something like chaser, taking off everything, crew hiding all over ship, no chance to make escape. Now, the widow of the ship's engineer, Henry Bates, she swore up and down that this was his handwriting. The bottle itself was made in Brazil. How does a message written in a panic, sealed in a bottle, wash up right where the ship went down, while the men themselves vanished off the face of the earth? Now, some folks say it was a mutiny gone wrong. Others think a phantom pirate ship boarded them, took what they wanted, and marched those men off into the fog. But if you talk to the old-timers down at the docks, they'll tell you the sea doesn't always need a reason. Sometimes the graveyard of the Atlantic just wants the souls, and it leaves the ship behind as a reminder that out there on the water, you're never quite as alone as you think you are. From the mystery of the deep sea, let's head back into the humid swamps of the interior, to a time when a whole town was held captive by a shadow. Stay tuned. More to come. Pour you another glass of Bucklesberry lemonade, and we'll be right back.
We now join our regularly scheduled programming already in progress.
Now, if you want to talk about a town that truly knew the meaning of living in a fortress, you've got to talk about Bladenboro, North Carolina. It's a quiet spot in the coastal plains, but back in the winter of 1953, the sun didn't set on a single unlocked door. It all actually started a few days before New Year's over in Clarkton, about 8 miles away. Someone claims they saw a sleek black creature, maybe 5 feet long. Well, it took down a dog. But by New Year's Eve, the beast, as it became known, had moved into Bladenboro, and it made itself known in the most gruesome way possible. Seems there was a man named Johnny Voss, and I want you to imagine being on Johnny's front porch on a dark, cold December night. Now, Johnny had two big, strong dogs. Now, these weren't just pets. They were outside dogs, work dogs, and they were used to fighting. Now, Johnny said his dogs put up the fight of their lives. There were puddles of blood all over the porch. But when Johnny went out there in the darkness, he says he found a pool of saliva that was bigger than any dog could possibly leave behind. Now, the creature killed the first dog at 10:30 that night. Now, Johnny's daddy wrapped the poor fella in a blanket. The plan was to wait for morning and then do the right thing and bury him. But this creature, this beast, well, it had the nerve to come back. And it snatched that poor dog right off the porch while Johnny and his family were all inside. Then it came back again at 1:30 in the morning to claim the second dog. Now, days later, Johnny and his family, well, they found those dogs in a hedgerow. And it was a sickening sight. One dog's head was torn open and its body was crushed and wet, like it had been chewed and rolled around in a massive mouth. The other poor fellow, well, that dog, his lower jaw had been ripped clean off. Now, the residents, well, they were advised to stay indoors after sunset. The police chief, he warned of a predator in the swamp. Now, by the first week of January, the town was in full-blown panic. More dogs were found. A goat was found with its head flattened. A pet rabbit, which was found clearly decapitated, and it was still warm. Gruesome stuff. Graphic, I know, but that's the story. But here's the detail that earned the creature its vampire-like reputation. An autopsy was performed on one of those dogs on January the 3rd, and the vet reported that there wasn't more than 2 or 3 drops of blood left in the entire body. The jawbone, it had been smashed back, and the blood was just gone. Then there was that sound. A young boy named Dalton Norton reported seeing a big cat on his porch, and he said it made a noise that sounded exactly like a baby crying. Can you imagine standing in your kitchen and hearing what sounds like a crying infant on your dark porch, knowing what's actually waiting out there? Now, that's a scary thought for sure. Now, hunters from Wilmington, they came down to help. They tracked it through the swamp for miles. They found claws at least an inch long, and they found something even more terrifying. There wasn't one set of tracks. No, there were actually 2 sets of tracks. One was an 80 or 90-pound animal, and the other much smaller. It seems the beast may have had a mate or a cub. One woman claimed she saw it run toward her in the early evening. She said it looked like a big mountain lion. She screamed, bolted. The police chief measured those tracks in the dirt road. He said they were bigger than a silver dollar. It's been said that upwards to 1,000 men with guns hit those swamps. It was the biggest hunt in North Carolina history. They were looking for something black or maybe brownish and tabby with runty-looking ears. And a cat's face, of course. But whatever it was, it must have been a ghost. It said it watched them from the tree line, and just as national news cameras started rolling into town, the beast simply quit. Maybe it moved on. Maybe it died in the deep swamp. Some folks say it was just a confused cougar, but the old-timers who saw those crushed and wet dogs, Those bloodless autopsies, well, they didn't use the word cougar, but they did use the word beast. Well, we've talked about things that hide in the swamp, but what about the people who lived here before the mountains ever had names? Stay tuned. Up next, the Moon-Eyed People. If you head your way into the Blue Ridge, near Murphy, North Carolina, the Cherokee tells stories of the ones who were there before them. They call them the Moon-Eyed People. Now, they weren't like you or me. They were small, with skin as white as lily, and enormous, glowing blue eyes. But it seems those eyes couldn't stand the sun. They were blind in the daylight, so they lived underground or in the deepest shadows, only coming out when the moon was full. You can still find their traces, ancient stone walls and strange fortifications setting high on the ridges. Well, they don't match any human building style at all. Legend has it they were eventually driven deep into the caverns beneath the mountains after being at war with the local Cherokee. And some of the old folks say, if you're quiet enough in the high woods at night, you can still feel them watching you with those big blue moonlit eyes. All right, we've traveled from the railroad tracks to the caves. Let's end it where we are now and head back to the coast with a shadow that doesn't want to hurt you and wants to keep you very much alive. This is one of my favorite childhood stories, originally shared with me by my grandmother. This is the story of the Gray Man of Hatteras. Now, down here on the coast, we don't just watch the Weather Channel, we watch the dunes. Because for over 100 years, maybe closer to 200, people from Pawleys Island all the way up to Cape Hatteras have reported seeing a specific neighbor that some rather not meet, but some are glad they did. They call him the Gray Man. Now, he's not a ghost out for revenge, and he's really not trying to scare anybody. He's more like a sentinel. He's described as a shadowy, indistinct figure in a long gray coat, just walking the shorelines or standing on top of a dune, looking out at the Atlantic as the sky starts to turn that bruised, greenish, yellow color. Now, the legend says he was a sailor who died at sea, or maybe a local who got caught in the marsh during a storm back in the 1800s. Supposedly now he spends his eternity trying to make sure no one else suffers his same fate. But here's the mystery part of the story. It isn't just about seeing him. It's about what happens next. The old-timers say that if you see the Gray Man, you have an overwhelming sense to just back up and leave. And supposedly, people have come back after massive hurricanes like Hugo in '89 or Matthew in 2016 to find their neighbors' houses completely leveled while their own home didn't lose as much as a single shingle. And don't think this is just something from the old days. Seems just a few years ago, back in 2018, when Hurricane Florence was churning up the coast, a man was out on the beach near the dunes, making his last-minute boarding preparations. He looked out toward the surf as the spray was starting to kick up, and he claims he saw a figure walking, steady and calm, right along the water's edge. The man thought it was a neighbor who'd probably lost his mind, and he started yelling for him to go inside. The figure stopped, turned his head just for a second, and then simply dissolved into salt spray. Just vanished into thin air. Now that man didn't wait for a second. He threw the last of his bags in his truck and went straight inland. When he came back after Florence passed, the dunes were rewritten. The pier was thrashed. But supposedly, according to the story, his house, he was sitting there like it just spent the weekend in a vacuum. Not a single drop of water inside. He's a shadow in the salt air. A reminder that the coast has its own way of looking out for its own. So if you're ever down on Hatteras and you see a man in a gray long coat standing on a dune while the barometer is steadily dropping, don't bother going to ask him the time. Just get in your vehicle and drive. And before we finish up tonight, we thought we'd dust off 2 previously released episodes and add them to this collection because they're going to fit right in. Stay tuned. We've got the Ghost Hunt of Brown Mountain and the Goat Man of Nag's Head. They say the tale of the Brown Mountain Ghost Hunt began not with a scream, but with a silence. Johannes, a German immigrant, came to these mountains in the early 1800s, bringing with him a hunter's instinct and old-world respect for the wilderness. One autumn, with the mist rolling off Linville Gorge like a living thing, he ventured deeper than most dared go. And what he chased, no one knows. But we do know he never came back. His hunting party searched for days, their lanterns swinging pale light across the gnarled trails. They shouted his name until their voices cracked, only to have their cries swallowed by the whole of the mountains. They found no footprints, no rifle, not even a scrap of clothing. Only the unsettling hush of the Blue Ridge, as though the earth itself had taken him. The first whispers came from the mountain folk, those who lived by the land and feared its moods. On moonless nights, they said, the stillness would break, split open by the baying of hounds. Not the eager cry of dogs on a trail, but a raw, desperate sound, as if they chased something that could never be caught. Then came the thundering of hooves, phantom hooves, pounding across ground that no horse had walked, shaking the very bones of the night. Old man Silas swore he once felt it before he heard it, a chill like cold fingers on the back of his neck. Camped by a creek, he listened as the spectral hunt came alive around him. The hounds baying, hooves pounding, and then he swore. The man's voice cracked with terror, calling in a language that Silas didn't understand. German, perhaps. Then came the gunshot, one deafening crack, and then nothing. Silence, as thick as the lid of a coffin. Was Johannes the hunter that night, or the hunted? Some say he was dragged across the threshold of this world by something that was neither man nor beast. Others claim his spirit still runs those ridges, doomed to relive his final moments in an endless chase. On certain nights, they say, you can still see a lantern weaving between the pines, bobbing like a will-o-wisp, always searching, but always too late. But those who know the mountains will tell you the hunt never ended. And if you hear the hounds crying in the dark, don't follow, don't answer, because some hunts, well, they never find their way home. They say the pines of Nag's Head Woods remembers everything, every whisper, every wrong, every restless soul. And on certain nights, when the fog curls low and the sea sighs like a sleeping beast, you may hear the goat man still walking among the shadows. Long before the vacationers came, before the beach houses and neon lights, was a man who lived alone in a sagging yellow shack deep in the woods. He was a recluse, a hermit. Folks said his only friends were his goats, sleek, proud creatures with bells that chimed softly when they gazed into the deep thickets. The man kept to himself. The townsfolk, well, they returned the favor. But there were stories, whispers of strange rituals, offerings left in the woods, prayers not meant for God. Then came the night of the trespass, a band of reckless teens, full of drink and daring. They made their way down to the yellow shack. They wanted a thrill, a story to tell by bonfire. Instead, they found the goats. No one knows what they did, but by dawn, the goats lay dead, their bells stilled forever. And the man, the hermit of Nag's Head, he was never seen again. But the woods remember, and so they say, does he. Hikers have heard the clatter of goat hooves behind them, only to turn around and find nothing but the mist. Couples walking the trail at night claim to see a figure, tall, crooked, bent, with horns catching the moonlight, stepping from tree to tree. And those that swear they've heard his voice say it comes as a rasping whisper. Leave them be. They were all I had. Some tell of teenagers who went searching for him. Those same woods swallowed their laughter, and returning, only silence. The goat man doesn't like trespassers. Not then, not now. So if you find yourself walking Nag's Head Woods at night, don't follow the sound of the bells. Don't whisper his name. And whatever you do, for God's sakes, don't laugh. Because the goat man still mourns his goats, and vengeance never sleeps. North Carolina is truly a place where the line between what happened and what they say gets real thin, real fast. Maybe Edwin is still waving that lantern in Pactolus. Maybe the gray man is still walking the dunes of Hatteras. And perhaps the goat man is still roaming around. Or just maybe we need these stories to make sense of a world that's a lot bigger and a lot older than we are. Either way, next time you see a light where the tracks used to be, or a shadow on a beach before a storm, don't be so quick to call it a trick of the light. Some things in North Carolina, they just don't want to be forgotten. Thanks for sitting with me tonight. Stay safe out there in the dark.